welcome back to the Deep Dive. You guys
Really threw us a curveball this week.
with this article. It argues that Biden's playing a...
Dangerous game with U.S.-Israel relations, right?
His term is ending. And with the tension between...
Israel and Iran, plus that humanitarian crisis.
unfolding in Gaza. Well, let's just say there's a lot...
Let's unpack here.
Yeah, and this article goes pretty deep, actually suggesting that Biden's using military aid as leverage to...
Pressure Israel, like a bargaining chip.
Okay, so we're not talking about just the typical U.S. support of Israel here. This is next level. But before we get into all that, I think it's helpful to understand what's happening right now in the Middle East. Can you set the scene for us?
It's a volatile situation, to say the least. The Israel-Iran conflict has been simmering for decades, but right now things are really heating up. Israel's threatening military action because of Iran's nuclear program, and Iran's responding with their own threats. It's like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And Biden's stuck right in the middle of it, trying to keep the peace. But he's also got less than a year left as president, which this article says is a huge factor in how he's handling this whole thing.
Absolutely. It's like he's trying to negotiate this incredibly high-stakes peace deal with a time bomb ticking in the background. Every single move he makes is magnified by this countdown.
So let's talk about some of those moves. This article focuses on the recent deployment of 100 U.S. soldiers and a TOD anti-missile system to Israel. What's the significance of that, especially considering everything else going on?
Well, first off, the U.S. deploying THAAD is a really big deal. They don't do that every day. This system, it's designed to intercept ballistic missiles, short, medium, and intermediate range. Basically, it's a very strong message to Iran saying, don't even think about it.
So it's like a warning to Tehran.
Exactly. But it's also a message to Israel. Deploying THAAD tells Israel, we've got your back, but we're also going to be more involved now, even in your defense strategy.
So it sounds like the U.S. is taking a more active role instead of just providing support from afar.
That's a great way to put it. This isn't just about selling weapons anymore. It's about putting U.S. troops and U.S. technology right there on the front lines with Israel. And that gives Biden some serious leverage.
Which brings us back to this whole idea of the carrot and the stick. We've talked about the carrot, all this military aid, but what about the stick? What does the U.S. want from Israel in exchange for this increased support?
This is where the article gets really interesting. It talks about a letter almost, like an ultimatum that Biden sent to Israel recently with a 30-day deadline.
An ultimatum. Wow. You don't hear about those very often, especially between allies. What does it say?
Basically, it demands that Israel make some major and immediate improvements to the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Okay, so the Gaza Strip's been under Israeli blockade for years now. It's a humanitarian crisis for sure. But honestly, how much leverage does the U.S. really have here? I mean, Israel has resisted international pressure on this for a long time.
You're right. It's a tough situation to change. But this letter, it seems like Biden administration is really serious about using their military support as leverage. Like they're saying, if you want our help, including things like HOD, you need to show us that you're serious about fixing things in Gaza.
So they're taking a tougher stance now.
Yeah, I think so. This is much more assertive than what we've seen from past U.S. administrations.
But does Biden have what it takes to make this happen? And what kind of concessions are we even talking about here? This feels like something we need to take a deeper look at.
Definitely. That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. This article brings up more questions than it answers. But that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Let's dig into those questions then. You're right. Just saying improve the humanitarian situation, it's pretty vague.
Yeah.
This article does go deeper, though, and this is where Biden's strategy gets really interesting.
Okay, so what are we talking about specifically? What does the U.S. want to see happen in Gaza?
The letter lays out some key demands. First, they want Israel to increase how much humanitarian aid is getting into Gaza.
Okay.
Like a lot more. More food, medical supplies, all the essentials getting through those checkpoints.
Okay, that makes sense. It seems like something most of the international community could get behind, right? But is it enough to actually make a difference with this humanitarian crisis?
That is the million-dollar question. The article says that Biden's demands, they go beyond just aid deliveries.
Okay.
He's also pushing for Israel to loosen up the restrictions on movement and trade for Gazans.
See, now we're getting into some really tricky territory. These restrictions, they've been in place for years, and Israel says they're necessary for security reasons. It just doesn't seem very likely that they'd give in on something like that.
You're right. It's definitely a major sticking point. But the article brings up something that might surprise you. Back in the 90s, the U.S. used loan guarantees to get Israel to participate in peace talks with Palestine.
Loan guarantees, like using their financial power to influence things.
Exactly.
I can see how that might be relevant here.
It shows that the U.S., they've used their economic leverage to sway Israeli policy before. And even though this situation is different, it suggests that Biden might be ready to play hardball on this, especially if he thinks the stakes are high enough.
And with the whole Iran situation looming over everything, yeah, I think it's safe to say that the stakes are pretty high right now.
Yeah.
But even if Biden can get Israel to make some concessions on Gaza, how does that help with Iran? How are those two even connected?
That's a great question, and it's something that the article really digs into.
Okay.
The main argument is that if the U.S. can address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, it gives them more power, more leverage when they're dealing with Iran.
More leverage how? What do you mean by that?
Think of it this way. If the U.S. is seen as taking a tough stance against their own ally, Israel, over a humanitarian issue, it makes their position stronger when they criticize Iran's human rights record.
Ah, okay. It's about moral authority on the world stage. If the U.S. is going to be the one pushing for a peaceful resolution with Iran, they can't be ignoring what's happening in Gaza.
Exactly. It's about being consistent, being credible, and the article says that this is something Biden really gets. He wants to build a big coalition to put pressure on Iran, and that includes Arab states who care deeply about what's happening in Gaza.
So addressing the humanitarian crisis, it's not just the right thing to do, it's a strategic move for Biden. It helps him deal with both the Israel-Iran conflict and his international standing.
Right.
But it all depends on Israel being willing to play along, which we've already talked about is not a sure thing.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And there's another layer of complication here that we haven't even mentioned yet, the upcoming U.S. election.
Right, because how this all plays out could have a huge impact on the election.
Exactly. And we need to talk about that because it adds a whole other level of uncertainty to this already crazy situation.
We were just talking about the U.S. election and how that throws a whole other wrench into this situation with Israel, Iran, and Gaza. It's like we need one of those big conspiracy theory boards with all the strings connecting everything.
It's definitely complicated, but that's what makes all this so interesting, right? We're not just looking at one issue by itself. We're trying to figure out how it all fits together, and the U.S. election is a big part of that puzzle.
So how does Biden's approach to Israel, this carrot and stick thing, play into the election?
Well, it could make some important voters unhappy. Pro-Israel groups here in the U.S. might see it as a betrayal, especially if they think it weakens Israel's security while things are so tense with Iran.
Yeah, that makes sense. But couldn't it also appeal to voters who care about human rights and want to see a more balanced approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the tightrope Biden's walking here, trying to keep both sides happy, both at home and internationally. The article suggests that he thinks taking a strong stance on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza will actually help him in the long run, even if it ruffles some feathers now.
So it's a gamble, with potential upsides and downsides. But what if Biden isn't reelected? What happens if the next president has a totally different approach to the Middle East?
That's the million-dollar question, and something this article doesn't really answer. Whoever takes over is going to inherit this huge mess, and the choices they make could have a ripple effect across the whole region.
It's really hard to say how it's all going to play out, but at least we have a better sense of all the moving parts now. We've got Biden trying to manage this really delicate situation between Israel, Iran, and even his own political situation. He's using military aid to try to get Israel to make concessions on Gaza while also protecting them from Iran. It's a lot.
It really is. And don't forget this. It's all happening with the U.S. election looming over everything, which adds a whole other layer of uncertainty. There are no easy answers here.
Definitely no easy answers. So for our listeners who just took this deep dive with us, what's the one thing you want them to remember?
That's a good question. I think the biggest takeaway is that everything's up in the air right now in the Middle East. Any decisions made by the U.S., Israel, or Iran in the next few weeks or months could have major consequences.
And we've seen how those decisions are influenced by so many different things. Politics, security concerns, humanitarian crises. It reminds us that there are always different sides to every story, and understanding those different perspectives is so important if we want to make sense of the world.
Well said.
And on that note, we'll leave you with plenty to think about. You can find the link to the article that started this whole conversation in our show notes. Check it out and let us know what you think. Until next time, keep those brains working.